Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to our live event today. I'm Stuart Lau, EU-China correspondent for Politico Europe. And today we are very happy to have two distinguished guests here joining us physically, the Japanese ambassador to the European Union, Mr. Yasushi Masaki, and the Secretary General of the European External Action Service, Stefano Zanino. Also joining us virtually today is Carlo D'Andrea. He's Vice President of the European Chamber of Commerce in China. In the next 35 minutes or so, we'll be having a discussion on EU-China relations in the context of reducing European dependency, why and why not. We've seen the economic security strategy already from the European Commission. There have been a G7 statements on de-risking. So the question right now is not whether, but how and when. So we'll start with Stefano, maybe. Tell us more about this EU strategy behind, the latest China relations, because obviously the European Council is also going to talk about China relations later this week. So where are we headed to?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, everybody. First of all, the strategy, and we are stressing this point, is country agnostic. So we do not want to have a strategy against any specific country. We're just trying to make it sure that the European Union could be on a sort of safe ground when it comes to its own security. But strategy has three main pillars. One is about promoting, so the idea of what we have to do ourselves in terms to increasing our competitiveness, our technological capacities, technological strength. And then there is another component, which is the one of the protection, and it's more about the de-risking element, de-risking, not decoupling. It's a very important distinction. So how we can reduce the excessive dependencies and how we can avoid to have the critical dependencies from third countries. And finally, the idea of partnering. So we have to do it not alone, but together with the other partners. And we identify not only a possible like-minded, but also countries that are maybe less like-minded, but with which we share a certain interest to define this framework. Now, the first discussion, the proposal has just been presented. There will be a first discussion at the European Council this week, at the end of this week, and then we'll start the process. The strategy is a framework, so it's not, there are no specific initiatives, but it's a framework which is trying to identify the context in which we want to put ourselves, and then on the basis of this we will decide what else can be done. I can go on a little bit, but maybe we can come back on more on the content, if you want, of the specific pillars of the this strategy.
No, absolutely. I think before we move on to the ambassador, of course you just had the EU-US consultation on China as well. Even though you said the economic security strategy is country blind, basically. We don't look at which country, but it's quite obvious that from this very long statement that I have to rely on from the computer, it's all about China, whether it's economic coercion, whether it's level playing field, whether it's de-risking. And I think, your counterpart, Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary, in her tweet, she said that the EU and US approach to the PRC has never been more aligned. How much of what we're doing in the EU here today is in alignment with the US? Because obviously we're seeing a lot of disagreement even among member states about how far to go on China. Can we really have a joint, united EU approach on this together with the US?
I think that we can have both. We can have a joint EU approach on this, and again, I'm insisting on the point of de-risking, so how to reduce the risks of excessive exposure. We had already a number of instruments at our disposal. We are not starting from scratch. Remember that we had already the 5G toolbox. We had already we are working on the anti-coercion instrument. We had the screening on foreign direct investments. We want to complete this framework with a number of other proposals that we will need to present that are not easy, and I'm not underestimating the difficulty when it comes to export control or to the screening of outbound investments. So there will be a lot of work that needs to be done. But I think that there is a common understanding about the need to de-risk our economy from, once again, from excessive dependencies. Now, the story is what we have done in the context of the EU-US dialogue on China. This is an exercise that we have been running for 2.5 years, and it's an extremely useful exercise, I think, to bring together different positions, I would say perceptions, sometimes to try to align actions. And it is true that the convergence in terms of perception of what needs to be done, it's extremely high between us and the United States. But again, I would like to keep the two tracks separate, because otherwise you run the risk of creating some confusion.
Thank you. Moving on to you, Ambassador. Japan was one of the very first countries to come up with economic security as a strategy under then former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, of course, the late Prime Minister. How has Japan been progressing with economic security? And if you look at what the EU is proposing last week and this week, do you think they have drawn any lessons from Japan?
Thank you very much, Stuart. First, I'd like to say hello to all who are following this online event. I'm very happy to be here, always with a very good cooperation with POLITICO. So you are right, Stuart. We have enforced the law, which is called the Economic Security Promotion Law, already last year. And at the end of last year, also, we have announced our national strategies of security. And one of the pillars is economic security. So this year, I have seen the EU's new announcement of economic security. We are very encouraged, because economic security is easy to announce, but difficult to implement. We need really coordinations with like-minded countries. Of course, the United States or Asian countries, and EU now is in the same line as ours. So I think our economic security will be more effective by coordinations with our partners. And I like to join Stefano. Our economic security is not destined to a specific country, even if you explain that in the context of relation with China. But I think the most important thing is how we can realize our economic security. Security is more and more intertwined in the areas of defense security and economy. And we have to work closely with a major country like the EU and the US. And also, a very important element is in compliance with international law, notably the WTO. So that's why I think now we have an EU who is appearing as advocating economic securities countries. So US, Japan, and EU will work closely, and that can be expanded to all the countries which have the same concerns. But I like to repeat, that has never been destined to exclude whatever country.
And of course, economic security strategy, as the European Commission has proposed, is more like an umbrella term with different policies, with different initiatives underneath. So I think the last panel also touched upon this, which is the technical difficulty of carrying out some of the initiatives. For example, how do we do outbound investment screening? How do we stop our companies, European companies, investors from going to China, for example, to invest? I mean, do you think Japan has any lessons to offer in that regard?
We are never in the country which can give a lesson to others, but you know, we have so many experiences with surrounding countries. Sometimes we have suffered by coercive measures, and also we have a problem of the lack of our critical materials. So maybe that will be a very good experience. So I think now EU also is facing, or will face more, this kind of challenges. So how we can have a more assuring supply chains, or of having critical materials without violating the multilateral system of trade and investments. So I think that's a very important point. So Japan is not a leading country in this area. So if Japan says we are in a position to give a lesson to EU or to the US, no. But every country is suffering, and more in Asia. So I think it's important for us to broaden our discussions, how we can have more assuring supply chains or economic security and so on. So now EU is coming, a very good newcomer to discuss more.
We'll go into further details, but first let's move to, I believe, Shanghai, where you're based. Carlo, very warm welcome to you. How is the reaction from Chinese businesses on the ground to the European proposals for economic security, for anti-coercion, for de-risking? I mean, how is the reaction there?
So today is not raining, so it's a good news, I would say. Besides this, I'm really happy to share the panel with Ambassador Sannino and with Ambassador Masaki. Of course, with you, Stuart. It's always happy to be here back with Politico. Indeed, we are living in a moment where doing business in China became more and more complicated. Just early this week, we presented our last publication, which is the Business Confidence Survey 2023, which arrived the first publication was done in 2004. So it's around 20 years we are carrying on this survey, which is the temperature of the European business here in China. Well, the results, as you can imagine, are not that good. We have a negative approach and negative sentiment coming from our members. We have a platform of 1,800 members, which over 550 answered to our survey, and 62% of our members said that they lost opportunity of doing business in China due to the market access barrier, and 64% said that doing business in China became more and more complicated. There are many reasons. We believe that one of these is that is our quarter look to China through the lens of the Ukrainian war, and also how the COVID-19 was managed, and the 2 months of total lockdown of Shanghai is still a vivid memory in the eyes of many of CEOs back in Europe. So China is still the second economy of the world. We have still a lot of opportunities in theory as a European business. But the point is that now we are between a rock and a hard place when we are deciding where and if doing business in China.
Yeah, and just a follow-up, as we were talking about earlier, there will be a European Council summit again with all the 27 leaders talking about China relations again. And the draft conclusions that we've seen, of course, Stefano will not comment on it publicly here, but there's a very interesting statement because it's saying that the EU will seek to rebalance its trade and economic relationship and ensure a level playing field, which is basically a recycled version of previous statements. But we're talking about 2023 now. Are we still in a position where the EU can exert any meaningful influence on China to ensure a level playing field for European businesses in China?
We should never stop to ask for. And of course, this we shall point out the shortcoming of China. I want to tell you that before COVID, as you know, more or less, Europe and China trade every day 2.3 billion euros. And at the moment, after 3 years of COVID, the trade deficit of Europe comparing to China is 400 billion. We should talk about it because this is definitely not an healthy trade relationship. I will tell you a bit more on the number of containers in order to give a better picture to our colleagues offline and online. In 2022, from China to Europe moved 6.4 million containers. This means around 16 million jobs created in China from the European market. Instead, on the other hand, you have from Europe to China only 1.2 million containers moving from Europe to China. You can understand that this is not something sustainable in the long term. So as European, we should continue to ask China to buy more European products. And let's discuss about this on trade. I give you also the example on investment. In the last 20 years, all European assets invested in China are around 170 billion euros. You may say, Carlo, this is a big number. I say, numbers always depend. And if you compare with the investment that the European they are doing into US, for example, you realize that this amount of 170 billion euros is more or less what the European companies are doing in 12 months in the United States. So Sweden invests more in the United States comparing that all the 27 countries investing into the Chinese market. Or if tell you better, we have European invest more in Texas than into the Chinese market. So there is a lot of way that we can prove. Indeed, I loved what Mr. Sannino said, that we should look into which one are the critical point where we are dependent on China. This is definitely right. I love the also Madame Fonons when she was using the word of the risking is also something that Chinese start to speak about it. And if we are discussing which one are the material that Europe is really dependent on China, we are discussing about only 7% of the trade that Europe is doing with China, rare earth, vitamin D, which you have to look into prospective things. And it's important that we as Europeans continue to bring on our discussion, to continue to have, to require more market access, to require a level playing field, because we are still good part of China GDP and China taxpayers. Let's not forget that.
Thank you, Carlo. I think you raised a very interesting point, which I'd like to bring back to the room here in Brussels, which is about identifying the sectors and the type of products that we are talking about when we do this kind of economic security measures. Maybe we can talk a little bit about, EU working with like-minded partners, Japan, for example. How much work has already been done to identify these sectors, and 20%, 30%, and how much more are we going to follow up on this after the last few months of G7 statements and EU security, economic security? How much work are we talking about here, Stefano?
I think there is a lot of work that has been done and that will continue doing. And now the work that we are doing on the alliance on critical raw materials is certainly part of this story. I don't know, Andrea, which figure was mentioning, but when it comes to the critical dependencies from China, we are speaking about a relatively limited amount of products, and also globally it's a relatively limited figure. We speak about less than 3% of the overall trade. And it's very specifically targeting some of the areas in the green technologies, especially the wind technology and solar technology, and then on some specific critical raw material like lithium or magnesium. So I mean, it's not a huge amount of products that we are speaking about, but the dependency is huge because we are speaking about more than 90%. So essentially, what we want to do is to reduce this dependency, to make it sure that again we are not creating a situation that can be disruptive for our markets in case there is a problem arising. So it's and even when it comes to the idea of control on outbound investments, we're not speaking of a generalized rule. We want to have a very targeted, specific, and only concentrated again in certain specific sectors where we think that could create a damage for our industry, or that can go into technology that can be employed from the military point of view. So I want to be clear that we are not speaking, when we speak about de-risking, we are not speaking about decoupling. We do not want to decouple. I think that Andrea was very clear in explaining the relevance, the economic relevance of China from the trade and from the investments point of view, even if he was rightly putting in a perspective compared also with other countries. But we do not want to destroy wealth. But exactly because we do not want to create situations like others that we have lived in the past, we want to make it sure that our economies can stand on their feet and and are not obliged then to find hastily alternatives that then are much more complicated and potentially much more expensive.
Right. And Ambassador, I feel like, I was just back from a trip to G7 Hiroshima in Japan, and I feel like, a lot of the Japanese business sentiment that I was hearing was also a bit like what Carlo was describing to us right now, meaning that there's massive investment from Japan in China, and there's got to be a very cautious approach when it comes to not decoupling for sure, but even de-risking, right? What is the government-business relationship there in Japan?
Well, Stuart, I think for us, China is very important in the trade and investment. Still, there are many companies who are making business with China. And you are right. Recently, they started to having some concerns because of the points which our friend has mentioned earlier on the domestic law on China, which will be arbitrary or disruptive to the daily businesses. And so I think they are now hesitating to adopt a strategy to China. But that will not say we can exclude our trade and investment from China. China is a big country, and no country can't survive without China, economically, politically, socially, maybe. So I think how we can engage China, it's a very important point, which EU is sharing with us. US is also, I think. And I think we have two different points. One of that is a level playing field, which our friend from China mentioned. That is very important. But what kind of LPF issues exist? It's not the outcome of trade or the investments figures. We should see one by one what are the problems. And our approach from Japan is always to see the compliance with international law, such as the WTO. China has entered the WTO many years ago. They have the benefit from that. So now we like to engage China is to comply with the requirement of WTO. And also China has developed economically very well. So it's not well adapted to that levels of requirement when they enter the WTO. So I think those legal things have to be rediscussed and to be reviewed to be more adapting to China to see the real level playing field. That's one point. Another point which you are discussing is economic security. It's totally different from that. So you asked us what kind of sector we are specifying on that. I think still we are, each country, EU, Japan, US, has different approaches. For example, Japan, concerning critical materials, we have designated 11 items of critical materials. Of course, it's not destined to the Chinese critical materials. So I think EU will do that later. And so I don't know how that we can specify that. And in the critical technology, I think we have so many. And now we have discussed thoroughly in the past already chips and medical services, equipment, and so on. But it's coming. Maybe we have other sensitive technology which is more advanced, such as AI or quantum technologies or space or cyber. So I think we should have more cross discussions with our partners where we can work together or where we have a different positions. So that's, I think, what we are now.
Of course, a very big reason why we're talking about de-risking in the EU here is also because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and then all of a sudden opening all the geopolitical Pandora's box about what might be happening in East and South China Seas, in Taiwan especially. Stefano, you were also talking about Taiwan with your US counterpart in the dialogue. So how is this going to be the ultimate risk factor when we talk about de-risking? I mean, when the EU deals with the relations with China, is Taiwan as big an issue as it is between the US and China?
I wouldn't characterize this as the ultimate risk. I think that what we need to look is the complexity of the relationship with China. The Chamber of Commerce, the European Chamber of Commerce in China has made huge work in terms of defining the potential let's say hurdles to the activity in China. There is this dual economy element, which also comes into account. There is an element of in the political intervention in the economy. We are not speaking about a normal market economy. So these are all elements that are creating, let's say, potential risk. No, I'm not saying that Taiwan could not be one of those. This is one of those, but I mean, I would put it as a sort of in a broader context about the potential risk that we are facing. Then I go to what I was saying before. What we want to avoid is the risk of burning a lot of wealth in Europe because of lack of prevision, on the capacity of foreseeing the potential risks that are coming, and that's what we are trying to do.
And of course, when we talk about Taiwan semiconductors, it's also such an important topic as well. As we know, TSMC has been investing and is going to open a plant in Japan next year, the most advanced semiconductor manufacturer based in Taiwan. The EU also relies on Taiwan for up to 90% of the most advanced chips. So, Ambassador, when Japan handles this issue, how much of that reshoring is happening, and how, because from what I understand, the TSMC plant in Japan only deals with not the most advanced types of chips, because Taiwan still wants to keep that on its territory. But is that still a potential problem when it comes to reshoring of the most advanced chips that Japan and the EU also need?
Well, Stuart, I think first there are many risks over the world, and one of the risks is, of course, around Taiwan. Our position is very clear. We are opposed to the unilateral change of status quo by force, and we have to always protect the security around the Taiwan Strait. That's the basic positions. And you are talking about chips. Of course, chips is a very important industry. As you mentioned, Taiwan is more advanced. And also we try to promote our chips technologies because we have spent so many years to leave it to other countries, including Taiwan. So it will take time. But for us, the risk is not only the chips. If we have really emergent situations around Taiwan, that will be closely linked to the security issues for Japan. So I think so it's more than only the sensitive products. But at the same time, in this context of the supply chain, Taiwan is a very important area which we have to secure. So that's why I think we will strengthen our Taiwanese companies and so on. You are talking about the company's factory in Japan is not producing high advanced chips. Well, But at the same time, I think every country like EU, we try to catch up with our readiness of the development of chips industry. I hope that we can be done. But if each country are doing the same things parallelly, that will be really the loss of cost. And that's why I think it's important to have the partnership with like-minded countries like US or EU and Japan to have a more efficient supply chains which are showing.
Carlo, we have a few minutes left, so I'd really like to ask you something that was also picked up by an earlier panel. I think Heiner Pütikofer, the MEP, was talking about the competition facing the electric vehicles between European and Chinese car manufacturers in China. So Volkswagen, even the biggest car manufacturer, isn't doing that great in EVs in China. So how is that competition playing out in China, and what is the Chamber's advice to the member companies in China?
I like the discussion that you are bringing on with the ambassador. We should engage with China. Happy that we had the visit of the President Michel, or President von der Leyen. Now, next month, will come the Vice President Timmermans, and as well Borrell, and we are waiting Dombrovskis by the end of the year, and as well Chinese visiting Europe. Is really important to continue and to restart to building bridges. Regarding the Chinese market, the new energy vehicle, we always say to our member, you should be at the table, because you are, if not, you are in the menu. And this is really important when you are discussing about the Chinese market. The new energy vehicle, last year there was 7 million cars sold in China. So for European producer, the Chinese market is a gym where they can train themselves and bring back technology in Europe. Indeed, when we are discussing about a new energy vehicle, there are still market access barriers, and there is the need of reform and the lowering of the access to the market for a European company in the market. Now is the moment the Chinese shall walk the talk. They don't need only to say we're going to do it, we're going to see it. It's really important to have a fact that will bring confidence and trust in the Chinese market. And this, as European Chamber, what we are advocating with them.
Yeah, we have a couple of minutes left, maybe going back to Stefano for some last thoughts about the upcoming Council Summit. Can you tell us more about the stage where we are at? Are we still trying to agree on certain things, or are we at the stage of laying out the details? I mean, because from what we have heard, obviously a lot of member states have different opinions, vastly different opinions about what exactly to do, how far exactly to go. Have we got an agreement yet, actually, among member states?
On China, you mean?
On China.
Well, I think that yes, I mean, for me, there are three key elements in when we are speaking about China. The first of all, that there is a need to manage the complexity of the relationship of a country that has, a major role on the world scene, and that is an unavoidable factor from many points of view. The second, and you have both mentioned the point of the engagement. We need to engage China on things that where we have common interests, like climate change, but also on things where we disagree and where we can have a different point of view. And third, it's about de-risking from the economic point of view, so to reduce the excessive dependencies and the critical dependencies from a certain number of materials. On this, I think that there is a very common basis among the member states. I'm not saying that everybody sees things exactly in the same way, but this is and I think that is a solid basis that, if coupled with the principles of partner, competitor, and systemic rival, gives you the sense of where we are in our relations with China.
Right. Ambassador, some last thoughts?
Yes, thank you very much. I think, so next you are going to have a European Council very soon. Certainly the China economic security will be discussed. And we are going to having a bilateral summit with the EU in July.
Yes.
And the economic security might be one of the very important area to be discussed by leaders. So I hope that EU and Japan could strengthen more our partnership also in this area of economic security.
Indeed, we look forward to possibly having an interview with the Prime Minister when he's in town. But thank you very much again, everyone, for being here with us this past half hour. We will have another session at 4:35, Europe's digital sovereignty and the global chip race, which we've just briefly talked about. But for now, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.